Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
So glad to have you with us for the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. As you know, Jim Garrity is off for a while, but here in his place today, we're very happy to have Inez Stepman with the Independent Women's Forum. She's also host of the High Noon podcast. And if you don't follow her on Twitter, you're missing out. Excellent commentary on a wide variety of issues. And Inez, it's always good to have you. Thanks for your time.
It's always great to be here, Greg. Thank you.
Well, let's start with our good martini today. First of all, we're happy that we actually have one. That's not always the case. But the good martini is the pushback, because last week during the State of the Union, I know it's going to shock you, but Joe Biden said some things that weren't exactly true on a number of issues. And one of them was his ongoing rant about shrinkflation. And for some reason, he decided to take a specific pot shot at Snickers. And so here's that quick little snippet.
Commercial on Snickers bars. You get charged the same amount, and you got about, 10% fewer Snickers in it.
Yeah, so people are laughing at him, and it turns out it's not true. Snickers actually releasing a statement saying we have not reduced the size of Snickers singles or share size in the U.S. Like many industries, we continue to face high inflation and spikes in material costs. However, we work to absorb these extra costs wherever possible to provide affordable treats and the best value. Final prices are always at the discretion of the retailer, but we make every effort to minimize costs to provide a full range of delicious products. So obviously, Inez throwing a little bit of shade back at the president for the inflation, which he is responsible for. But Biden so quick to try and shift the blame for inflation to these horrible, horrible corporations that he can't even pick one where the story is actually accurate. So his story falling apart again. And good on Snickers for not just taking the punch, but firing back.
Yeah, I mean, this was definitely one of Biden's stranger sort of obsessions is picking out some of these small annoyances of life and then promising that he's going to fix them. He did this with, for example, with ticket overcharges and stuff like that. This seems very much in the same category, except, as you say, Greg, it is an attempt to deflect from the obvious problems in the economy with inflation. I mean, it's not entirely untrue. There are companies that are making smaller sizes of things. I've seen that in the grocery store myself, but that is an attempt to deal with the fact that prices overall have increased and have held quite high. The Biden administration always pointing out that inflation is slowing down, but it hasn't change the fact that prices have gone up incredibly and then stayed high for consumers. So every family is feeling this. Everybody going to the grocery store is feeling this. I think it's really hard to take the position the Biden administration has, which is basically this isn't happening. And if it is, it's because Snickers wants to give you less Snickers. I think that's not a very good answer for the American people. I don't think they're going to get very far with that one, honestly.
First of all, I love Snickers. Whenever we get the mixed bag of bite-sized candy bars for the Halloween trick-or-treaters, I always kind of fish out the Snickers. I'll leave a few in, but at the bottom of the bowl, just in case, because I can't eat all of those. But you mentioned the junk fees too. He keeps talking about the junk fees, and nobody likes the extra Ticketmaster charges. And if it happens to get wiped out, that's great. But it's kind of like the do not call list. It's not going to really change anyone's vote come November, but maybe it's nice to have at least a little distraction from his incessant "you're all killing democracy" line that I think is going to be dominating his campaign.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely showcased that in the State of the Union in the first about 10 minutes. I will say that I think overall the State of the Union speech, I agree with sort of the polling afterwards that showed that people liked this speech. I think Biden did himself some favors with this speech, especially since the bar was so low for him. I mean, the fact that he didn't basically collapse on stage and dealt with the age issue as best he could. I think that will probably help him. I mean, look, I don't think the State of the Union matters that much for the election one way or the other. People will have forgotten that speech by then. But I do think that there are vanishingly few people who can lie the right way about being a labor Democrat the way that Biden can, even though his administration has been very culturally radical. He's still he sounds like a sort of FDR Democrat a lot of the time. And he's done it several times with his State of the Union speeches. And he did it again with this one. And I think we would be foolish on the right to underestimate how many people, read a few lines from this speech or see a couple clips from the middle of the speech and conclude once again erroneously that Biden is a moderate. And he's really good at presenting that. And I think that's, by the way, why, as old as he is and all the problems that he has, they don't have a really good alternative to replace him with, because there isn't anybody coming up behind Biden who can do that kind of labor Democrat dance and lie about the things that he lies in a convincing way to people who are really looking for somebody who is a moderate. And he does that well. I know that it's inaccurate because, we're obsessed with these things and we follow day in, day out. I see what his agencies are putting out every day in terms of regulatory stuff. I can see that he has not run a moderate administration, but I do think he has the ability, and we would underestimate that, I think, on the right, to our peril. We forget that does have an appeal in the country.
No, it does. But the big picture, that's what Republicans need to remind him of. There was a video floating around the internet this weekend of Biden being the response to a George H.W. Bush presidential address where Biden was harping about how they're not tough enough on the border, about drugs coming into the country. I mean, it's just a total shift over the last generation plus from this Democratic Party about where they are on that issue and many others. I mean, they're still to the left of even back then of where we would want them to be. But if this Democratic Party was up against that Democratic Party, that would be a pretty stark contrast.
Yeah, with crime rates as they are in most major cities, I can maybe we'll see a return to 1994 crime bill Biden, where he takes crime really, really seriously. And you can see even in this speech, right, picking up a lot of Republican messaging on the border and blaming Republicans, something, by the way, that I firmly blame Mitch McConnell for, and sort of moderate Senate Republicans for, setting up this PR victory for the Democrats by allowing them to come with this quote unquote compromise bill that had absolutely no Republican border enforcement priorities in it and calling it a border bill. That bill never should have emerged as the compromise. And I think it really shows how out of touch some of the Republican leadership is with the priorities, not just of their base, but in this case, their fellow senators, right? And their colleagues in the House to be able to hand Biden a victory like that. But yeah, I mean, this speech was sort of shameless in a way, in the way that it picked up some of those issues that Biden knows that he's losing on, like the border, and pretended that Biden is on the right side of those when very clearly there has been no greater disaster on the border than the policy changes that Biden has unilaterally made from the previous Trump administration in terms of enforcement on the border. But his ability to lie about it, I mean, again, I think we would underestimate that at our peril. And that was an own goal given to Biden, I think, by Republican leadership. And that's really what we saw in that piece of the speech. But yeah, on the economy, I think he's still losing, like the stuff we talked about with Snickers. I think that because it's something that hits people in such a tangible way in their pocketbooks, I think lying about that, if anything, I think it backfires on Biden because people know that this isn't true. But when he talks about what was in the border bill and how, Republicans wanted a campaign issue, I mean, if you're not following that issue super carefully, you don't know what was in that bill in particular, you don't know what Republican objections were to it, that sounds plausible. And we would be, again, foolish, I think, not to understand how that sounds plausible to somebody who's maybe just hearing a few lines from this speech and concluding that, yeah, Biden wants to enforce the border, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, I didn't hear anyone in Senate leadership on the Republican side or in the negotiations, meaning Senator Langford, bring up the House border security bill at all, as this is our starting point. And we're not probably going to budge very much from this. How much of this can you give us? And instead, like you said, they basically surrendered on border opportunities. Biden feels a little bit schizophrenic on this because on the one hand, he's co-opting the issue. And on the other hand, he's apologizing for referring to the guy who brutally murdered Laken Riley as an illegal. Oh, I'm sorry, undocumented. Well, actually, he is documented as a person arrested for assault in New York City and who came into the country illegally. So he's trying to shore up the lunatic fringe with those comments and also win the middle. And I'm not sure he can do both.
Yeah, I mean, he has successfully been able to do that. I guess it's a question of the Democratic base and how much they're willing to tolerate. And I think that answer is probably a lot, given how much they hate Trump. It is probably, I saw some of these issue polls a while back, and just Trump, the name Trump, appears in the top several concerns of Democratic voters over and over and over again for years, But yeah, I mean, Biden does have this problem because his skill, his strength as a politician has always been to be at the center of his party. And that's why we were talking about how many contradictory positions he has over the years. He's always been able to put his finger in the wind and be in the center of the party and appear sort of like a moderate Democrat, but one that was still acceptable to the Democratic base. And that has been his political strength. The problem is the Democratic base is pulling so far away from where independents are. And you see that especially in surveys and polling when you look at by age group, right? Democrats do rely to some extent on young people coming out to vote. And I mean, this is a longer discussion about education in this country and how we've really failed to pass on any kind of continuity in American values that were previously taken for granted to millennials, Gen Z, and now Generation Alpha coming up behind them. Obviously not voting yet, but if you look at those numbers on just about anything, I think the Israel-Palestine conflict is indicative in this way. If you look at the numbers are reversed from the rest of the country, not just from Republicans, but from independents and other Democrats. The numbers are like overwhelmingly flipped. And you can see that on a lot of, especially a lot of cultural issues. You can see where the mean, like sort of Democrat activists, and you see that also with young staffers, by the way, who are coming out and, cowardly not signing their names to these statements on Israel-Palestine and so on, where the mean Democratic activist, the person who's dedicated to politics, who's going to be a staffer for Democratic congressmen or senators, a person who's going to come to DC, right, and work as an intern after college, that person has views that are totally unacceptable to the American sort of independent mainstream. And so that dance that Biden has done for a very long time, for decades, quite successfully, I think is a little bit like dancing on a fault line with, two continental divide, pieces coming apart under his feet. I mean, I think the future of this country, I think if you look at the future of both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, I think you see a widening gap, and you see that even within the old guard of each party and the people coming up behind them. But yeah, I don't know how much longer Biden can do that dance, but I mean, gosh, I don't know how much longer Biden can do anything. So.
That's a good point. We drifted a little bit from Snickers, but we got in a lot of good content there. But anytime you can talk about Snickers, it's good. And the fact that they're pushing back against Biden is also good as well. I'll tell you what else is good. Fast Growing Trees, which is the biggest online nursery in the United States with more than 10,000 different kinds of plants and more than 2 million happy customers right here in the United States. You can grow lemon, avocado, olive, or fig trees right inside your home on top of the wide variety of houseplants they have available. Fast Growing Trees makes it easy to order online, and your plants are shipped directly to your door in just 1 to 2 days. And along with their 30-day Alive and Thrive guarantee, they offer free plant consultation forever. We have ordered a number of fast-growing trees, from the lemon plant to the monstera to the fig tree. We love them all. We have not had an issue with our trees, but we have heard from friends once in a while, one will get a little bumped up in shipping, but the Alive and Thrive guarantee, they say, legit. If you have an issue, they will make it right, and they'll make it right real quickly. Right now, Fast Growing Trees has the best deals online, up to half off on select plants. And listeners to the 3 Martini Lunch get an additional 15% off their first purchase when using the code MARTINI at checkout. That's an additional 15% off at fastgrowingtrees.com and using the code MARTINI at checkout. Fastgrowingtrees.com, code MARTINI. Offer is valid for a limited time. And tell them that we sent you. All right, on to the bad martini now, Inez. And we have real bad news when it comes to the semiconductor industry. And it's all thanks to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And usually when Biden has these State of the Union messages, he talks about the big semiconductor plans that they're building here domestically, especially as Taiwan is threatened by China's saber rattling and so forth. But we have a problem. Intel is announcing that it's putting the brakes on its Columbus factory. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, known as TSMC, has also pushed back production at its second Arizona foundry. And the remaining major chip maker, Samsung, just delayed its first Texas facility. So why is this happening? Well, it's due to the CHIPS Act and the DEI conditions that are in it. Great op-ed in The Hill explaining this says the law contains 19 sections aimed at helping minority groups, including one creating a chief diversity officer at the National Science Foundation and several prioritizing scientific cooperation with what it calls minority-serving institutions. A section called Opportunity and Inclusion instructs the Department of Commerce to work with minority-owned businesses and make sure chip makers, quote, increase the participation of economically disadvantaged individuals in the semiconductor workforce. Also, the department interprets that as a license to diversify. Its fact sheet asserts that diversity is, quote, critical to strengthening the U.S. semiconductor ecosystem, adding, quote, critically, this must include significant investments to create opportunities for Americans from historically underserved population. And one of my absolutely favorite euphemisms of all time is that included in this list, it's not just about race and gender and LGBT and all this stuff, but also it has justice-involved individuals, which are more commonly known to us as ex-cons. So these companies, which were more than delighted to be building these facilities in the United States, certainly as a backup if anything goes wrong with Taiwan, but just to have more production facilities altogether, now getting strangled by DEI.
This is a really bad martini. Reading this story is just an encapsulation of how unserious the United States has become, particularly at a time, as you mentioned, of rising geopolitical tensions with China, the possibility of a conflict over Taiwan, which currently has the vast majority of superconductor manufacturing, which is a huge problem, not just for America, but for the Western world. And this is very complicated manufacturing. This is very sophisticated manufacturing. It's not something that is easy to train overnight for workers. This is a high skill job. And the fact that the United States is so unserious, and by the way, I would point people to the fact that these are both things like little DEI pork tidbits that are written into the CHIPS Act by legislators, but also their interpretation through this piece kind of glances over it, but their interpretation through Biden administration agencies that are adding on top of that multiple regulations, saying basically, okay, here, you have to hire this proportion of minorities. They don't say it quite that explicitly, but the fact that this ideological red tape has made it so difficult to manufacture something so critical in the United States should be a glaring warning sign to both on the domestic manufacturing front, of course, with those jobs, but also to our ability to be serious enough to stand up to what is likely to be an era of great power conflict more than the past 20 years or 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. I don't know. This is just really depressing to read that we are a country that prioritizes this kind of ideological nonsense over what is critical national security manufacturing.
So it's national security and economic security versus their diversity agenda. I know which side ought to win. I also know which side I think they're going to choose in this showdown, and I don't like it. They're going to stick with the DEI side, right? This administration and the left?
There is no doubt. And by the way, again, there is this administrative state angle to this where, Biden may not have even looked at or approved a lot of these kinds of like strings on grants. This is just what our administrative agencies do. They produce these kinds of strings on already usually bad bills, and they produce these kinds of grants that require as condition of acceptance, oftentimes these very like ideological concessions from companies. And I mean, if you look at the places where these companies are going, and the article I think rightly points this out, you're talking about Poland, Israel, there was a third one that I'm forgetting, but these are places that are vulnerable in a certain way. And this article points out, Poland shares a border with Ukraine, that there's a war there going on. Israel is obviously in the middle of a war itself, but apparently those risks of Hamas rockets and the threat of Russian invasion is less worrying than the total inability to hire the kind of high-skill workforce that you require. And again, it's not because we don't have these people in the United States. It's because those people don't fit the profile, the sort of racial profile of what the DEI ideologues would like to see if you're looking at a high skill manufacturing job. And by the way, like, there are also, people have been working on these kinds of plants in Taiwan. So some of these companies are straight up bringing, let's say, 500 workers from Taiwan to the United States. Now, I understand that, we want people to be hired from the United States, but in this case, it seems like such a direct national security implication. It's critical, again, not just for us, but for the Western world, that we have these manufacturing plants up and functioning as quickly as possible. And the idea that we're going to avoid that because we wanted to hire, more left-handed queer Black activists or something like that is just insane. It's completely insane, but it's a real indication of the, unseriousness of the United States at this point.
And the discrimination against Asians apparently now goes beyond admissions and other areas of our cultural life. And now that they can't even work in the same companies they had been working with overseas, it's just utterly absurd. And you're right. Unfortunately, our current ruling class is not going to choose the right side here. And the implications could be very, very serious. All right, Inez, this is a story that was tailor-made for you. I remember when the big kerfuffle was happening over "Baby, It's Cold Outside," and you got very active in that debate, at least on Twitter. And we now have an immense case of backpedaling, perhaps, from the Secretary for Veterans Affairs, and it all deals with one of the most famous American photographs of all time. This really broke last week, and it's over the photo of the sailor kissing the nurse in Times Square the day that the Japanese surrendered and brought an end to World War II, mid-August 1945. And so millions of Americans have seen that photo. We at the American Veterans Center, who I happen to do veteran oral histories with, actually got to interview both of those people. I spoke with George Mendonça as well as the woman, Greta Friedman. She unfortunately was having some memory issues at the time, but she was still able to tell her story fairly well. George Mendonça, total character, just died a couple years ago. He's pushing 96 years old at the time. And here's how he explained what happens. Well, he was on a date with his future wife, actually, who was not the nurse. They were at Radio City Music Hall watching the Rockettes when all of a sudden the show stopped and they announced that the war was over. The Japanese had surrendered. So everybody pours into the streets. They go to the bar, got a little bit liquored up, and then they headed out into the streets to revel a little bit more. And then he saw the nurse and gave her that kiss that is now immortalized. And here's why he explains why he chose the nurse.
Let's go back 5 months in the war. We're still back in the Pacific. And just before we left out there, the aircraft carrier, the Bunker Hill, she got hit. She took a couple of suicide dive bombers. Some of them planes on deck started exploding and burning up. It was a hell of a fire. And we was ordered to go alongside of her. And there was a lot of men on the Bunker Hill that were trapped in the fires. Well, they started jumping off the Bunker Hill, and we picked up hundreds of them. We met the hospital ship, the Solace was the name of the hospital ship. And we're transferring the wounded onto the hospital ship. And I saw what those nurses did that day. So now back in Times Square when the war ends, and I saw the nurse, if that girl did not have a nurse's uniform on, I never would have done that.
All right. Well, fast forward to 2024. Well-told story there by Mr. Mendonça. We now have the Assistant Undersecretary for Health Operations at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Her name is Rima Ann. And they apparently have real problems with this photo. They say the Department of Justice's current definition of sexual assault includes any non-consensual sexual act or any act where the victim cannot consent. This definition is adhered to by the department when applying our policies and guidance. Employees have expressed discomfort with the display of this photograph, suggesting that its presence could be construed as a tacit endorsement of the inappropriate behavior it depicts. So to foster a more trauma-informed environment that promotes the psychological safety of our employees and the veterans we serve, photographs depicting the VJ Day in Times Square should be removed from all VHA facilities. This action reflects our dedication to creating a respectful and safe workplace and is in keeping with our broader efforts to promote a culture of inclusivity and awareness. In celebrating the end of World War II and the valiant service of our veterans, facilities should seek alternative photographs that capture the spirit of victory and peace without compromising the VA's commitment to a safe and respectful environment. Well, obviously, that's a bunch of hot garbage, and there was big blowback to the memo. And so Secretary of Veterans Affairs Dennis McDonough gets on Twitter and pretends that none of this ever happened and says, let me be clear, this image is not banned from VA facilities, and we will keep it in VA facilities. So, again, a lot of backpedaling here, and as given everything we have to deal with, just pure insanity.
Well, I guess there's sort of the downside and the upside, the bad part and the good part about this story, right? Because, obviously the downside is this insane reaction and is reflective of a larger movement that does not admit any kind of humanity or ambiguity in relationships between men and women, that sees no difference between, spur of the moment kiss in Times Square in the jubilation of the end of an extremely bloody and horrible war and rape that admits essentially like no actual interaction between men and women, which is by its nature a little bit ambiguous, a little bit push-pull, a little bit like there's no room for humanity in the way that I think the left thinks about those interactions. And frankly, I think it's because they pack everything into this concept of consent. They've lost the ability to talk about sex morally. They've lost the ability to talk about sex, about good sex versus bad sex, or a good kiss versus a bad kiss, right? And that all smacks of judgment and scary things that they don't want to get into. So they've packed so much into this concept of consent that they've lost the humanity of it. They've lost the ambiguity. They've lost the fact that people do things spontaneously or on the spur of the moment, that they don't fully consider the fact that, women don't always know their own mind in these situations, right? They don't have like a signed, sealed, delivered, 10-point bullet point list of the things that are acceptable to them in any given moment. There's just a sort of inhumanity of it all. So that's all bad. That of course this is continuing, and it's combining in a bad way with this. I would say almost like a modern iconoclastic movement of tearing down anything that we might find vaguely objectionable in 2024 about the past. But on the flip side, this reminds me very much of the William Penn statue story, where once this got out to the public is no longer having this crap. This like cancellation of historical figures or iconic photographs over, modern concerns of various sort of levels of accuracy, right? There has been a massive backlash, as there was against the dragging down of the William Penn statue. And then you have kind of this bureaucratic backpedaling, oh, we never meant to do that, right? And that I find quite encouraging. The fact that people understand what this is, they no longer get drawn into the debates of a debate about the nitty gritty of is this person, is this person in the past, are they worth celebrating or not? Like, let's have a nitty gritty debate about every single thing they might have done wrong in their lives. They're skipping all of that. And they're just saying, no, like, that's enough. Stop it. Like, stop tearing down American iconic photographs, whether or statues to heroes of the American past, because they were imperfect by 2024 standards. So it's encouraging to me that people they seem to understand that given an inch, they'll take a mile, and they have to just do a hard stop on this stuff.
It's nice, and it's good to have outlets like X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, and places that allow the speech to flourish there, because on other sites, who knows whether that would have been given the light of day. So, yeah, the idea, the memo got put out there. People had the chance to respond vigorously, and they had to make the right decision there. But knowing where they wanted to go with that is absolutely ludicrous. So, Inez, good to have you with us today. Thanks for your time as always, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thanks so much for having me.
Inez Stepman with the Independent Women's Forum, also host of the High Noon podcast, which you can find every week on ricochet.com and other platforms, of course. I'm Greg Corumbus of Radio America. Thanks so much for listening today. Do subscribe to the 3 Martini Lunch if you don't already. Tell your friends about us as well. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us on Twitter. Inez is at Inez Felcher. Jim is at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a great Monday, and join us again on Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.